You might have a killer melody or a very strong riff, but if your mix isn't right for that lead, then it will not perform well. So you can basically ruin a whole track by having the wrong mix. And I want to show you in this video my steps which I run through, which help me to really place elements well in the mix to get them to their most powerful state. And by the end of this video, you will know also how you can do a better mix with your leads. In this video, we will talk about low conflicts, about setting the right volume, about EQing elements, about compression, about placing them in the stereo field, and also a bit about delay and reverb and other things. So stay tuned and watch this video till the end, because I have some tips for you which might be very valuable for your mix. I have so many times screwed up tracks because I didn't put my leads in the right mix. It's really important that you nail this, and it's not easy, to be fair, but I will show you my 7 steps I usually run through if I do my mixes. So let's compare these two leads. They have the same notes, they have the same synth preset, but they have a different mix, and you will notice that one is strong and one is really weak. If you like the kick and bass and drums of this track, then it's really important actually that you get this right. So you need a strong foundation, because if you're setting up your whole story, your whole leads and everything on a weak foundation, they won't sound good as well. So before you go into mixing the leads, you actually need that. And I really know, because I struggled so hard when I was starting out with that kick and bass and drums is something which is very difficult for beginners, and especially if you don't have the right studio and if you don't have the listening for it. So that's why I set up a BeatStar shop for you, in which you can get my kick and bass and drums, which I would use in my own tracks, so that you can download them and use them as a foundation for your own tracks. I will put a link up here and in the description box below. And by getting them, you're also supporting this channel. So thank you very much for that. So let's go step by step. Number 1 is control the low end. And actually I have a separate video about that, which I will link up here, which will help you to find low conflicts. But let me explain you really quickly. So what I define a low conflict is if I have too much below 100 Hertz. And especially I don't want to have anything below, let's say 80 or 70 Hertz. So if we look at this lead in solo, you can really see that it peaks over here, and it also has quite a lot in that area still. And that's something we really want to avoid. Actually, we want to avoid this like hell. So the first thing we will need to do is, and I boosted this here to exaggerate the problem a bit, but sometimes just because of the preset or the synthesis, you already have this problem. So really take attention, and if you don't hear it because your speakers or your room or your experience doesn't give it to you, then use the trick I show in the video I linked up here. So we want to cut it in the lows. So everything we had here, we want to remove with our low cut. And what I usually do is I look for the right mixture of frequency and slope. And if I want to keep a lot here from that area, then I usually use a steeper slope and go closer to the 100 Hertz. And if I want to keep a little bit less and shave it a bit more smoothly, then I use like a less steep slope, but a higher frequency. But you really need to evaluate it sound by sound. So it's not like a one-fits-all rule. So you basically look into the spectrum analyzer and you listen to the sound. And that's something I usually do in solo. Yeah, I think that's good. So that should be sufficient here. But anything you touch in solo, you should still take a listen also in the whole mix. I think it sounds good now. If this content is valuable for you, then please hit the like button. That helps me to spread this video and also shows me that this content is valuable for you. The next thing I usually do is I adjust the volume, because I think everything is a little bit tough to evaluate if you don't have it at least in the ballpark of the volume, and that's a really important thing. If you do the mix the first time, you want to raw chop it, and then you want to revisit it and go finer and finer. And I mentioned this in another video, but it's really important. Let's imagine you're a guy who chops a statue out of a wood block. Then you start with the axe, then you go to the knife, then you go to the small tools, and in the end you have sandpaper and oil to finish it. So and the same thing applies to your mix. You go very raw in the beginning, and then you go finer and finer and finer, and you don't need to do this in one session. So that's really the trick, because every time you change something, let's say I would change this element here now, then everything else in context changes as well, because maybe I have been masking stuff with this one element, or maybe if I now push the volume of this element, I need to push the volume of another element as well. And so you can imagine that everything kind of like comes together bit by bit in small steps, and every time you adjust something A, you will need to readjust something B. So that's something you need to consider, and we just want to get it like now in the raw ball. And a very good trick, as you have seen now, is you turn it completely down and then you move it really fast. You don't go like this, that you do it like in super small incrementals. You go very fast until you reach something which sounds good. And once we have found this, then what I usually do is I go like minus a dB and plus 1 dB and look if it still improves. So I think louder is better here. Let's go even louder. Minus 11.5 was a bit much, but I still think it could be a little bit louder. So let's meet in the middle. Now we can go a little bit down. So that's kind of like the fine adjustment. Don't overthink this, because it will go back anyways. If you don't want to miss out on future videos, then please hit the subscribe button and the bell icon. The bell icon is really important, because then you get a notification once a new tutorial is out there. And once we have set the volume, in the next step, in the third step, I go about EQing it. So let's check this out. So you can see in this spectrum here that it moves, and whenever it comes down here, I think it gets a little bit too much build up in that 1K area here. So we will add this little point. And I think the sound lags like a little bit over here, so we can push this maybe. And don't forget to listen it in context as well. Now, as we have this moving thing here, what you can do is you can also make them dynamic, so that they only react when this peak is not there, or even counter react if the peak comes there. And if you don't have a dynamic EQ, then I would bounce it to your audio and just follow it a little bit by hand to avoid too crazy peaks. But it's not a problem actually to have those peaks. You just need to control them like a little bit. So I think we are better now with EQing it. And you see there's like a +4. It's not a big problem, but if you want, you can gain stage this better to avoid this. It depends a bit. With 24 dBs, you have enough headroom usually. Sometimes it can be a bit cumbersome, and some plugins also react on the input level. So that's something you need to also take care of sometimes. But one thing which can be very beneficial is if you A/B things. So for example, if we copy this over now, and we would remove all the points, then we can compare A and B, and there we could also gain stages a little bit by looking here at the master level when we have it in solo. So it's like minus 15.4. So we basically saved like 1.4 dBs. We could add that again here. But to be honest, I don't do that when I EQ my stuff. If it sounds better, it sounds better. And I don't care if it gets louder or less loud. It just sounds better. And that's what I want to do in the end. And yeah, you might argue louder sounds better, but it's not always the case. So if you have some experience with mixing your stuff, then you will notice that louder is not always better, because you also don't want to have your sounds too loud. It's kind of like the opposite direction from where we started. I didn't show it in this example, but it can be really ugly actually if things are peaking out too much. So just to say this, I would remove this, and something I would address later. Now, once we have EQ'd this, we need to place this thing a little bit better in the room. And by placing in the room, I mean delays and reverb. And we will start with the delay, or actually we will start with the reverb, because I set it a little bit high here on purpose, because I know that a lot of beginner tracks, they wet everything so crazy and becomes like one big sound, but not a very beautiful sound. It becomes like one cloud of sound actually, and you really want to have your elements audible. So we will start with the reverb here first, but usually I do the reverb last. It's just like, as I said, the order isn't 100% fixed, and that's actually a good thing that we stumble over this, because now you can see that we shouldn't focus just like a specific order. We should always focus on what is the most important and critical issue, and in that case I think it's that too crazy reverb. So I guess something like this would be a better amount of reverb. Compare this. So it sits well in the mix, but at the same time, it's not crowding the mix. And the same goes for the delay. So I usually have things between 15 and maybe sometimes 60% feedback, and dry wet, I'm a little bit less if I put it in the chain. So I usually have like 10 to 35%, I would say. They correlate with each other. So besides you have some crazy effects you want to delay, then you usually don't want to have this at 70% and this as 50% if you have some line like this, because then all the delay will run over itself and you have one big mess again. So check this out. If we put too much in here, like this, and by the way, I rarely move this over 50% in the channel. And if I do, I usually go 100, because if you have over 50%, it sometimes sounds like you're out of time. It's not like a rule thing. You can do this sometimes, but just saying like. But anyways, we would have now too much delay. Listen to this. It gets way too crowded. As we have so many shots in here, we really need to go very smooth with this. So something like this here, and check it out with and without the delay. It's a very, very subtle thing. The same like with the reverb here. We want to embed this a little bit better in the mix. We don't want to separate this from the mix by creating this huge cloud of sound. We just want to wash it out like a little bit so that it integrates better into the sound. So it's really important that you have an intention about this, that you know where you want to be going. So do you want to move the sound more in the back or more in the front? Do you want to melt it more with the background? Or is it something you really want to maybe stand out and you need to be really careful with putting too much of this in here? And this is like a main lead sound, so we definitely don't want to wet it like super crazy and get it disappearing in our mix. So we just want to do this like a little bit here. And the fifth thing I'm usually looking at is the dynamic range, and you can control this with a compressor. And also here, please don't use this all the time everywhere. So just use this. I mean, I use it everywhere usually, but use it intentional. So either you have too much dynamic range and you want to control it, or you want to color the sound. And it's a little bit too much information for this tutorial, but I will link to up here to another tutorial about compression where I go a little bit more into detail about compression. But notice again the subtle change, which will help us to make the sound more present and more controlled. Just saying, like on other sounds, especially like acid sounds, I have this a lot, you might need to go more drastic. So basically this is the gain reduction you have, so how many dBs you're reducing, and some sounds really require that you go like, but not this sound. So that's really important that you don't just twist knobs for the sake of twisting knobs. Really think what you want to reach. And if you start to understand compression, then you really will understand how you can shape the sound. If you can make it more sharp by shaping out the transient, or if you can make it more smooth by reducing the transient with the compressor. So there's a lot of options you have with this tool. And I would say it's a whole journey of music production in itself to set up a compressor right. Because it's really difficult, to be honest. And I have another tutorial up here in which I tell you a little bit about hearing compression and what helps you to really learn what compressor actually does. If you don't want to miss out on future videos, then please hit the subscribe button and the bell icon. The bell icon is really important because then you get a notification once a new tutorial is out there. And then we can address the stereo field, and there's various options you have. Basically, stereo field is created usually to a left-right difference in your channels. And a few of my favorite tools is the wider tool, which you can download for free. I will put a link in the description box below, and the Voxengo MSED, which is also free. And I put also a link in the description box below. Those are my favorite tools, but you can also use different stuff like EQing, the Haas effect, and whatever other effects, psychoacoustic effects are out there for creating stereo field. But I want to mention that it's not about making the sound as wide as possible. It's about placing the sound in the right spot in the mix. So if you have main lead, you still want to have it like very centered, but you want to maybe open it a little bit to make it more atmospherical. And if you have some assisting elements, I place them a little bit wider and more on the sides. But the important thing is that you place different elements at different widenesses in your mix. And you can also use the left right here, which I use for single shots, but not so much for leads here. And notice we also put like a ping pong here with the delay, which also creates some wideness. So let me quickly remove the ping pong for you as a comparison. By the way, you can see actually the wideness here also by the left right differences, and you have the correlation meter, which also gives you information about the wideness. So there's not much difference in here. Once you turn on the ping pong, that balance gets like a little bit more thrown over the board and it gets a little bit wider. We could use something like this. And you notice those two go further apart and this correlation meter goes stronger to 0 here. But as said, a mix is always a mix of elements, so you will always need to listen that in context. And especially in this mix, I really want to have this element very centered, so I won't put this in here because I have the other element very wide on these sides. So this one can actually be in the middle, and the ping pong is enough for me here. So again, to mention this, it's not for the sake of putting stuff in here and twisting knobs. It's always what you want, what the sound needs to be in place. If you want to even go deeper into mixing, I have another video for you in which I do some practical experiments about mixing, which I will link up here so you can watch this video next.